and welcome to this episode of Attune In. I'm super delighted to welcome Windy Dryden to the podcast. Welcome, Windy.
Welcome.
Good to see you. Thanks for your time. And we had a conversation not long ago, and it was really nice to well, firstly, to meet you because I've personally read your work. I have read your work and been really inspired by your practice and your contribution to the field of talking therapies. And I'm going to just introduce you so everyone knows about you and your background and what you've been up to. So, Windy Dryden is an independent practitioner, trainer, and supervisor in the field of counseling and psychotherapy. He is a fellow of the British Psychological Society. He has authored and edited more than 290 books, including Good Practice in REBT and ONEplus Therapy, Help at the Point of Need. In addition, he edits 21 book series in counseling, psychotherapy, and coaching, including the CBT Distinctive Features series. His major interests are in rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, single session therapy, microtherapy, the interface between counseling and coaching, pluralism in counseling and psychotherapy, writing short, accessible self help books for the general public, and demonstrating therapy live in front of an audience, which is, a very fitting. It's very fitting to have you on this podcast because, as you know, my focus is now supporting and thinking about parental emotional well-being. Parents were often time poor. Often we are tired and sleep deprived, and long therapy sessions may not always work. And actually, you're saying that single session therapy, microtherapy, is an interest of yours. So I would love to sort of hear from you on that and how you got to that sort of conclusion.
Well, I think if you look at the data that of number of visits people make to therapy organizations, what you find is that the most common number of visits people make is one, followed by two, followed by three. And so, and when there is a planned intention to help people in a single session. About 70 to 80% of the people who come for a session are happy with it, and half don't require any more services, and half do. And so I'm interested because if you look at the training of counselors and psychotherapists, eh, largely it's devoted to training people to do much longer term work. And while I'm not saying that that should not happen, I'm saying that really we as a profession in counseling psychotherapy should really respond to people like the parents who you kind of produce material for, who, as you say, are time poor. And do they really want to go, to the business of making an appointment, waiting for that appointment to come round, and then, having an assessment, and then get round to talking about what their problem is, or would they like to kind of have very quick access to a trained professional and have a micro therapy session of about 20 minutes, which with a trained professional who can actually help them there and then with what they're concerned about. And uh, all I'm saying is let's cater for both eventualities. Let's not exclude these brief microtherapy interventions because we as a field in counselling and psychotherapy look down our nose at it, which I think sadly most counsellors and therapists do.
Interesting. And why do you think that is?
Because as I say, the idea is that, in our training, I mean, when I was trained, kind of brief therapy was regarded to be about 20 sessions. Um, Now, people get offered, 6 sessions, And even for quite a lot of people, that's too much for them, because they've got a particular issue that they want help with at a particular time. And if we can help them at that time, help at the point of need, and deal with helping them to take away what they want to take away, I think we're actually providing a good service. And as I said earlier, largely counsellors and psychotherapists are trained to do much longer term work, and which they regard as, you know, the Rolls Royce, if you like, of helping people.
Yes, really interesting. And it feels as though you're sort of speaking to the fact that we need to meet people where they're at.
Yeah,
And Um,
yeah,
not everyone has the capacity to have more than a 20-minute conversation when they are really struggling with a specific issue that is time critical. You know, by the time you've booked a session, the issue may have unfolded already, and it might not have necessarily unfolded in the most supportive of ways. So, actually, you're saying let's bring that support to people where they're at, but not say, look, no more conventional therapy. We're saying actually both and.
yeah.
Um, but there's resistance in the field because of the fact that most people are trained in that way. One of the things from my perspective would be, how do I know that a briefer therapy is actually effective? Because, you know, we still want to know that, okay, the shorter therapy, the microtherapy, or the 1 or 2 sessions, it is still going to have an impact. So, what's your clinical experience on that?
I mean, I've done sort of, as I say, loads of live therapy demonstrations when I do training courses, and the majority of those um, demonstrations are around about the 20-minute mark. So I've got a lot of experience of actually helping people in a short period of time. Now, I think when both parties, both the client and the therapist, know that they've got 20 minutes, know that they've got an opportunity to kind of really focus on something that the client wants to focus on, and that, you know, that they know that the therapist is not going to take a case history. They know that the therapist is not going to do large assessment of them as a person. They know that the therapist is not going to want to find out about all their problems and how they fit together, making up what's called in the field a case formulation to guide treatment. But they know that they're both on the same page. We're really going to focus on helping the person take away something that's going to make their life, better, even if it's for the shorter term. Then I think then that is far more effective than the field gives it credit for, because you talk to most counselors and you say, what can you do in 20 minutes? Most counselors will say, well, not a lot, whereas we say in the single session and microtherapy fields, we can do quite a lot in in 20 minutes. Um, but we can only do that if the client is understands what service it is and is really willing to kind of meet us, helping us to help them in the way that they want to be helped. When that happens, my experience is that people, as I say, go away, and in about 80% of cases, they say, that was really helpful. I don't, um, for the time being, that's going to help me. And in about half the cases, they'll say, well, actually, I don't need any further help, for a while, and they don't need to go back. Whereas, you can have, if you want to, another single session. Single session therapy doesn't mean one session and one session only. And having a therapy session is not really saying you can only have one 20-minute session and that's it. Um, you can have as many as you want, but don't build it into the we'll meet next week. Have it when you want it. When the parent wants the help, that's the time when they reach out. Whereas in more ongoing, more traditional therapy, you kind of meet once a week.
Yeah.
And I mean, I used to do that. And a number of times people would say, oh, I've had a good week. And I say, well, okay, what do you want to discuss? And they say, well, I'm fine at the moment. So, I don't think that's you go to your doctor and you say, "Well, how can I help you?" And they say, "Well, no, I'm fine." He's gonna be a bit lost. So, look, I mean, all I'm saying is I'm not suggesting that this form of help should replace
No.
more traditional, more ongoing counseling and psychotherapy because, if you want that as a parent, then, fine. All I'm saying is that this other form of help should be available to parents because that's, from my understanding of what you've been saying, Gary, people, you know, are struggling in the moment and yeah, they turn to themselves, they turn to their friends, they turn to, the internet. But if they have an opportunity to really receive personalized care in the moment, focus on their particular concern of the moment, why not?
Could not agree more. Why not? And just having that flexible approach that different isn't necessarily worse. And in fact, your experience is saying people are getting profound impact from these micro sessions. And just hearing that makes me reflect on just the beauty of the idea that if we as a client, like if a parent believes this in its own right can be helpful, they're more likely to engage with it in a meaningful way. And actually, it's more likely that it probably is helpful. So just hearing that you have really good experience of it working is probably really powerful for everyone to hear that actually it is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I say that if you have a situation, Gary, where you've got two people, the client and the therapist, who think that something meaningful can come out of a single session of about 50 minutes or a micro session of about 20 minutes that are somewhat different but overlapping services that I offer. If both people think that something meaningful can come from this, then it increases the chances of it will. If the client goes into it, thinking, "Oh yeah," and the therapist says, "No, no, then
Yeah.
nothing's going to happen." The therapist is going to be dragging the client in a certain direction, and the client's going to feel, "No, wait a minute, I don't want to talk about this." Whereas if both people go into it and saying nothing much can come from 20 minutes or an hour, then nothing will. So
In-
you do need, kind of both parties
Mm.
kind of, and we have so much data which says if people expect change, it's much more likely to happen than if they don't expect change. The expectation area in psychology is one of the most strongest has the strongest database in social psychology. Very very strong evidence, and that's what I want to kind of convey to your viewers and your listeners that you can get some meaningful help in a very short period of time.
And what a way to sort of r- bring down the barriers to getting help.
Yeah, I mean, this is help without barriers. This is what is called open access help. We don't have a long list of exclusion criteria. You know,
Okay.
the best way of judging whether you can be helped in either a microtherapy or a single session is to have the session and see what happens as a result of that.
Makes so much sense. No harm done, and actually potentially opening a really powerful door. Um,
Right.
I'm fascinated by I think it's a cultural shift almost that's needed, amongst professionals in our space, to really value the idea of briefer sessions, briefer interventions having impact. Because if our profession values it, then indirectly, clients and patients and, service users will as well. And I know there's some amazing research coming out of the US by Jessica Schneider's lab. They have quite a lot, they're doing proactively doing a lot of research on single session interventions, and showing some really good results.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think her work is a little different from what I'm talking about. I'm talking about where you have a live interactive conversation with a therapist. Her approach is more where she reaches difficult to reach children, adolescents who otherwise wouldn't get any help digitally. So I think there is a difference, and I think they're both valid.
Mm.
I'm talking about the more conversational, interactive, live
Live.
type of help that one of your parents. For example, let's suppose one of your parents were to ring me, and I would strive to help that person get back to them in a very short period of time. Hopefully that day we can have a conversation. I might ask them to prepare for the session a little bit,
Mm.
because I think if you prepare for a session like that, so much the better. I'd start off, the conversation, asking them, what would you like to walk away from our conversation today that would make it really worthwhile for you that we had it? And we would start there. And I would then, and also this work is very much strengths based. It's really looking at people as being the reservoir for their own coping. So we would kind of go looking for their strengths, looking for the times when they have actually solved similar problems and may have forgotten about it, looking at times when they've solved other problems that they can bring to the situation that we're talking about here, making use of environmental resources as well. Um, and so it's very strengths based, and really trying to help the person to be as autonomous as possible um, in that type of conversation.
And that really resonates with the values of, the work I do at the moment with coaching. So you're sort of speaking to building resilience and building coping strategies within them, so the parents
Yeah.
will build that empowerment for a more sustainable change, basically, so they can then sustain their well-being because they've gone in, thought about their strengths, thought about examples when their strengths really supported them, and almost reminding them of who they really are, and that this is a tricky time, but it's not going to define them. And I think that's really what we need to be, that is, as a society. I know the NHS, the 10-year or the recent sort of statement is, building strength within communities and people having that empowerment within themselves. And how do we build those tools? And that's something that can come through therapy, it can come through coaching. So I mean, do you, from your practice, what are the sort of what would be your main messages to parents? My focus with the platform and the coaching I do is around building good connection between parents and their children. Because I've noticed that when that connection is nurtured and when that's healthy, people's behaviors indirectly change for the better, and people's well-being changes for the better. So, do you have any interesting anecdotes, or have you got any strong opinions on this topic?
Well, I think yeah, it, it's all about making connections. I like to kind of look at parent-child interactions kind of within the context of the home in which it occurs, because quite often I will get a mother, for example, who comes and asks, with a problem about relating to one of their children, and I ask the question, well, what is your where does your partner come in? And so sometimes the partner doesn't come in at all, and sometimes you can actually help the person by recognizing that they can elicit a connection with the partner first before they improve the connection with with the child. um I, I I mean, issues, I tell you what, issues of anxiety are quite common in this space. issues of guilt,
Mm.
um, and also really kind of looking at the impact of the way people were parented
Yes.
on their style of parenting. That's an important, recurring theme sometimes.
Absolutely. Um, Helping parents be more aware and conscious of the way they were parented so that they can be more intentional and be more in charge of their own parenting style rather than just repeating letting the subconscious just repeat, or what I often see is people wanting to not repeat so much that they're not intentional either because all they're trying to do is not be how their parents were. So it's
Yeah, I mean, it's the way sometimes it's put to me. I want to be absolutely nothing like my father, stroke mother, stroke,
yeah.
and I mean that's impossible because you've apart from anything else, there's a genetic heritage you've had. You've had some parenting for that person, but you can be aware of your. I mean, I make one of the things I do a lot of, Gary, in this work is making a distinction between a person's initial reaction to some kind of event and their response to it. And so their initial reaction doesn't have to be continued. They can recognize and be mindful and compassionate to the way that they've kind of responded to to a child, for example, um, and then really stand back and take not a lot of time and you know, recognize what their choices are and actually kind of choose a pathway that they can actually want, even though some of that, emotional, upheaval is still going on in the moment. Another theme which I find recurs in this work is people being either intolerant or self-blaming about their own emotional reactions. You know
Mm.
that it's almost like I shouldn't feel this way, where the this way might be guilt, envy, angry, jealous, um, you name it. It's like you have an emotion which you'd rather not have, and then you kind of damn yourself for having that emotion, and that gives you two problems for the price of one, as far as I'm concerned. So a lot of my work is actually helping people to kind of recognize that as a human being, they are going to have these emotions, but that they can actually they're not prisoners of them. Just because you start off feeling guilty doesn't mean that you have to continue to feel guilty. Now, I think you do have to understand some of the factors that are involved in your guilt. This is what I strive to do in these microtherapy and single session conversations I have with people. If that's what they're looking for, help them to understand their emotions a bit more and how they can intervene so that they're not a prisoner of that particular emotion. Um, so that is something again which is quite a common recurring theme.
Mm, really powerful advice, that, we shouldn't feel bad for having a strong emotion. We do not need to be prisoners of that emotion. And I'm interested in what you said about processing guilt. So if a parent feels guilty, which by the way, I think we all do as parents all the time, irrespective of what we do or we don't do, it's just part of I don't know why, but that is seems to be a really common theme. And that actually guilt can be really helpful data that we can process rather than just sit with and feel damned by. Have you got any thoughts on how a parent can sit with their guilt, but also have the capacity to process it in a way that's helpful?
Well, yeah, I think. I mean, for me, I mean, this is where this, I mean, if somebody is talking about their guilt, I'll ask them how they understand their guilt. What are the factors that kind of make up their guilt, and if they struggle, I would invite them, to see if they're interested in my take, rather than give it in an uninvited way. I think
Mm.
we can, therapists need to be more invitational in that respect. Now, for me, guilt is has got a number of components. One is the component of I've either broken a moral code, I've failed to live up to a moral code, or I've hurt the feelings of somebody close to me. So that's what I call the adversity. And then people with unhealthy guilt, if you'd like to call it that, are bringing two attitudes to that adversity. One is what I call a rigid mindset. I must not have done this. I absolutely should have done that. I absolutely should not have hurt the feelings of my loved one. And also self-blame. I'm a bad person. I'm evil. There's something wrong with me in that sense. And so, depending upon where the person thinks that there's most kind of purchase to be made, that's where I'll intervene, because I asked them if that makes sense, to them, and if so, then we can intervene in an area, you know, that would have the best sort of purchase for them in terms of taking away what they want to take away. So, I mean, I think that we can also, in these um, microtherapy and single session conversations, bring some education to bear. Should that, should that be wanted?
Absolutely. That's very helpful. I thank you for that structure. That is really, really helpful for us to hear as parents. Um, what I found fascinating was what you said about rigidity. So having a rigid stance to the code that was either broken or not lived up to. And what can we say to that? How can parents be more flexible in their thinking? Let's think about, in a neuro-inclusive way, because obviously in terms of neurodiversity, we all have different ways of thinking. We all have different brains. We all have different levels of rigidity, all or nothing thinking styles, etc. Is it possible to become more flexible in how we think? If our inherent stance initially is to be rigid, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the way I see it, that there are kind of, you know, we start off with as human beings in an area that's important to us, something that we want to do or we want to have happen, or something that we don't want to do or we don't want to have happen. So we tend to be, you know, creatures of I don't know, we call it desire or preference. We kind of want certain things and we don't want other things. And so pure neutrality. When people say that they don't want to care, what they really actually are looking for is to have, that they can't choose between, do you want to, to do that or not? And say, well, I truly don't care, and that is indifference. But we do, quite often, and in the parenting space, we do care. Things are important to us, and so we always start with that area. Now, the pathway is either this: because I want this to happen, it has to happen, or I want this to happen, but sadly and regretfully, it doesn't have to be that way. Now, you know, given the fact that we are human beings and not robots, you know, we do have to accept the grim reality that we are mistake making organisms, and therefore to have a rigid mindset towards ourselves that we absolutely have to do the right thing all the time is, goes against the reality of who we are. So but sticking to the idea, look, it's really important for me not to make a mistake. Sadly, it doesn't follow that I must not, but because it's really important to me, I'm going to do my best to minimize it. And if I do make that mistake, I'll learn from it, because once you have a rigid mindset and you're blaming yourself, you're not going to learn from your mistake because you're so busy, blaming yourself, you're not going to learn from whatever it is you did. So
Mm.
flexibility is a friend of learning, whereas rigidity is an enemy of learning.
Interesting, really interesting. Because when I work with and actually when I was working in psychiatry, I remember the perinatal psychiatry job I did, I saw quite a few mums who were working in financial services or the legal profession, and the rigid thinking style works really well externally in those professions because, quick decisions need to be made, things are quite black and white. It's right or it's wrong, and you do the right thing. And that's how the brain is sort of chiseled in a way. And that is the reason for their professional success. But then what happened was when they had children and they were in the perinatal phase, there's very little that you can say is right or wrong, as you say, because we are humans, not robots. And equally, there's very little that we can really predict because children don't behave in robotic ways either. Um, and it was very interesting for me to reflect that some people need to be able to switch between the two thinking styles, so they need to be rigid for certain aspects of their life, maybe their work, but then it goes against them and it doesn't serve their well-being because their expectations are just they're not it's not going to happen with a baby. You could even let's take sleep. A lot of parents struggle with sleep deprivation. They put children in routines and then the child sleeps, but then the child starts teething and then the child doesn't sleep so well anymore. And this constant need to be flexible as a child grows and their circumstances change. So I'm really interested in the flexibility to go between different cognitive styles. It's a lot, isn't it, for a parent to have to do, but it sounds like it is helpful for them if they do show that flexibility.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would put things a little differently to put it, if you don't mind me doing that.
Yeah,
I
of
think
course.
that what you're talking about is in one area of their lives that things are clear cut, right? Whereas in the area of parenting, things are more messy, right? And I think you can be rigid in both areas. So, even in the clear cut area, you're still going to say, well, look, okay, this is right, this is wrong, and I absolutely must make the right decision and get into trouble there. So you can be rigid even in the clear cut area. But certainly in the area of more ambiguity, more messiness, if you try to adopt a rigid style there, then you really are going to be in a very bad way because it's not going to improve the messiness, and now you've got your own emotional disturbance to cope with as well as the messiness. And so I understand what you're saying, but I think that I wouldn't say that the rigidity is about in the first area. I think you're talking about an area where things are much more clear cut than in the parenting area.
Yes. I think I'm fascinated by how can we help parents who struggle to be flexible in the parenting space when they may
Right.
have had decades of their mind, thinking in a more rigid way, and actually they were rewarded for that, and that was part of their success. And then all of a sudden, that way of thinking, as you say, with childhood and children, it's messy. And actually, for some parents, when they talk to me, they sort of describe that it's really almost identity shifting to go from I'm potentially a perfectionist in my work, but I'm being told I can't be a perfect parent at home when my children are the most important thing to me. And there is that sort of identity and character about them that is a struggle. And then with the sleep deprivation and the hormones, it's a lot for some people who really do struggle with that.
Yeah, I mean, the way I would put it, just hearing you talk reminds me of of what happens when therapists who have what I call a conventional therapeutic mindset. They go in, they've been trained. All right, we start off, we kind of get to know the person, we do an assessment, we find out take a case history, then we're off and we've got, and so that's a particular mindset. Now, when it comes to working in a single session or a microtherapy way, you need to work from a different mindset. So it's about recognizing that the situation that you're in really calls upon a mindset that's going to help you to get the most out of where you are. And that's how I would introduce it. We don't just have one mindset. Yes, you may at work be, using a particular mindset. And yes, when you come home, you may have to make a shift to a more, sort of parenting mindset. But the beauty about human beings is that we can do that, not necessarily with ease, but we certainly can do that. I'm not sure, that that other animals, have that facility, but we certainly do. And
Mhm.
so, um, but it is difficult, and this is where compassion and understanding and acceptance comes in. Because if you then say, well, now I'm at home, I have to, I have to be flexible. Now you're rigid about being flexible, and then you're gonna then you're going to get yourself into a whole lot of trouble. So I think that, kind of recognizing the struggle, being compassionate, recognizing that this is something that many, many people experience. You're not alone in doing that. And that's why, having a community of parents is so important to actually share that. Um, and also recognizing that, you are a human being, yeah, whether you like it or or, or actually not. As there's a great quote, one of the great sort of quotes about how human beings I ever heard was on one of the Star Trek episodes, Star Trek: The New Generation. One of the other species came down and said, "Yes, human beings, ugly bags of mostly water." So I think if we accept that we're all ugly bags of mostly water, we share that heritage, but we've also got a very powerful brain, which we can, it does get into a groove, but we can learn to recognize and to be guided by different mindsets for different occasions.
Thank you so much. As a parent myself, and I'm sure people listening, you basically given permission to parents to say, "Look, it's okay if you struggle with this, but you can have flexibility with your mindset. You can." You're basically sort of saying it's not easy, but you can show compassion. It might take time, it might take a few, and also to get that support, get that sort of the tribe, the sort of community, and share stories and actually not have shame. I speak to parents and they do carry a lot of shame about this. They sort of say, I come home from work, um, and I snap at my children because
Look,
XYZ.
I mean, for me, if I can offer, my sort of take on shame, if you
Yes, please.
under these circumstances, I think shame, the ingredients of shame are one, you have an ideal image of yourself
Mm.
and you've fallen very short. You've had an experience, there's a big gap. I always say, um, shame is a Waterloo Station emotion, and people say, "What are you talking about?" Well, if you get off the tube at Waterloo Station, there's an announcement that says, "Mind the gap,
Huh?
mind the gap." So there's a gap between your ideal and you've fallen very short. Now you bring your rigid mindset and say, no, this is not acceptable. I must not fall that short. There's something wrong with me. Okay. Rather than kind of recognizing and say, yeah, I've fallen very short. I'm disappointed in that, but there's nothing wrong with me. I'm a human being. And so let me understand the factors that led me to fall that short. What was happening, which, as I say, you can't do once you're into self blame that goes along with shame.
I love that. Mind the gap. I love
Mind
it.
the gap.
Is that
Yeah.
your clever idea? You thought of
Yeah.
that? That's good.
Yeah.
I'm never gonna ever gonna forget it because that's exactly right. It's well, from my experience, and when I speak to parents, they have a sort of a bar, um, unrelenting standard, a bit like a high jump bar. And that is modifiable, isn't it? We choose our bars that we have for ourselves, potentially. Some of it comes from our own, what we've, our own rearing, our own schooling, etc. But that is modifiable, isn't it? We probably have
Well,
to be
I think
flexible with that
well,
as
I think
well.
I see those bars as really kind of um, pointers. It's a bit like, in there's a concept in psychology called self-actualization.
Yes.
And the person who kind of created this term was a guy called Abraham Maslow, and he says, look, self-actualization is something to strive for. You may never reach it, or if you reach it, it will only be for a period of time,
Ooh,
because being human, I mean, look at it like this, you remember those skaters called Torvill and Dean?
sorry.
No, I'm
Sorry.
showing my age here. Yes. Anyway, they were Torvill and Dean won the gold medal at the Winter Olympics, and they danced to Carmen's Bolero, and they got 6.0, which is the highest score you can get from each of the judges on both technical skill and artistic merit. All right, so it was perfect. Now, my point is, if right afterwards they said, "I'm awfully sorry, there was a technical difficulty. You're going to have to kind of skate again," they wouldn't have been able to have done that level of performance. So
Mm.
yes, we might temporarily, hit our standards, but we can't keep it up. Why?
Mm.
Because we're ugly bags of mostly water who have an incurable tendency to make mistakes.
Yes. And question here. So why do you think, is this a generational issue, do you think? Or do you think this is just human nature? Why do we assume we're not just water making mistakes? Why do we think that, where do you think that's come from? Do you
Well, I
think
think, look, I think, well, I think that kind of, I think people often don't understand that, as Maslow was saying, look, understand what you're striving for and keep striving for it, as long as you recognize that you're not going to attain it, or if you are, it's only going to be, for a short period of time. But use these things as guides, not for things that you absolutely have to achieve once and for all. So
Mm,
I think that we don't necessarily, for example, the people who are perfectionistic, they don't they don't respond very well to being told to lower their standards, right?
mm.
And so I would not do that. I'll say, well, keep your high standards, but be flexible about them rather than rigid about them. But
Okay,
the
great.
standards are fine, because the standards are, will actually guide you, will provide you with a guide of where you are moving to. But it is a process rather than something that
Yes.
is one achieved once and for all. I mean, as somebody said, with you don't clean your teeth at night and you say, "That's it. My teeth are perfectly clean. I don't have to clean them again." Right? This is
Mm.
maintenance.
Maintenance. Lovely. So what you're saying is, to parents who may have perfectionist traits, um, you can have them, you can have that the goal or the star, guiding star. It's about the process, and don't beat yourself up if you don't get there. But
Yeah, and don't necessarily reduce your standards, but be flexible about them, and you're more
mm,
likely to achieve them more of the time. Because if you're rigid about them, then when you don't reach your standards, you won't stand back and learn why, because you're too busy beating yourself up
mm,
to understand why. So and interesting. I always laugh because people often describe themselves as a bit of a perfectionist, whereas really they're a lot of a perfectionist. Like this bit of a perfectionist. But and people think that perfectionism. If they didn't have perfectionism, they would stop striving. I think that's
yeah.
we have these is as human beings we have what we call ideas about our problems. Like, for example, people say, well, if I don't worry, then something bad's going to happen. I won't be prepared.
Mm,
Um, if I'm not guilty, I'll be a psychopath.
mm.
And all these are misconceptions about our psychological states and our emotions, which actually gets in the way of us being as psychologically healthy as human beings. And I think my view is the more psychologically healthy you can be as a parent, a better job you will do at, at parenting.
Absolutely. And then setting the potential track for your child to think in a psychologically healthy way,
Which
for their
includes
future.
encouraging them to accept themselves for their errors, be compassionate towards themselves and other people, to strive for something, that's really important, to keep striving, but
Mhm.
to be a flexible along the way.
Yeah, amazing advice. I have a question. You
Yeah.
mentioned self-actualization, and Maslow, and this concept that, and I genuinely haven't figured this out, and I'd love to hear your views. It sounds as though some people can go through their whole life, their entire lifespan, and they may not have aligned their true self or their authentic self, and they may not have been able to actualize to their I know there's no goal. I know there's no end point to this. I suspect it's eternal, infinite self-actualization. Um, but as a parent, I feel it would be so nice to understand how can we raise the next generation with that in mind so that children grow a with a healthy sense of self, but b they know that as adults that it doesn't stop. We can continue to improve, continue to self actualize. I would love to hear your thoughts. I know that is a really big question. I'd love to hear
Well,
your
I think one of the things that I think is really important, and it's not very sexy as a psychological concept, but I think if we can encourage people, younger, our children to figure out, what's really important to them. I remember, my father saying to me when I was about, 15 or 16, he said, "Son, I want you to be a lawyer. There's only two kinds of lawyers, rich ones and millionaires." And so I said, well, father, there's only one fly in the ointment there. I'm not interested in the law. And so I think you do need to really help people to identify, what they're really interested in. But
yes.
I think what's really important is to kind of recognize the value of struggle, discipline, self-discipline, grit, determination, to keep going, when the going gets tough. These are the non-sexy but really central aspects of being psychologically healthy. Because, and this idea that maybe I'm showing that I'm an old man, but the idea of you've got to be comfortable. Oh, I'm not comfortable, so that I don't do it. And my response is, well, look, do it if it's important, but recognize that you're going to be uncomfortable. When because I had a very bad stammer when I was a young child and an adolescent, and I resolved to kind of do something about it. I heard some people speak about some bits of advice, and I had to put that into practice. Yeah, well, I was damned uncomfortable for a while, but I stuck with it, and then I found that I was less anxious and I stammered less. And so I think that the idea of, you know, oh, I'm uncomfortable. Okay, if you're uncomfortable, don't do it. No, if you're uncomfortable, do it if it's worth doing.
Yeah.
We're not suggesting that you do something that's you're uncomfortable. It's not worth doing.
Yeah.
So I think we can really encourage children to see the value of struggle, grit, determination, and self-discipline. Um, Allied to the idea of, yeah, this is important to me, you know.
Mm.
Um, but I'm going to have to struggle to kind of get there. And so I think that's something we could really, teach our children, to good benefit. as I say, it's not sexy, but I think it's important.
I think is so what an amazing concept. So figure out what's important, so values aligned, and then
Yeah.
even if it's uncomfortable, don't give up provided it was important. You're not saying just be uncomfortable irrespective just because it's uncomfortable. You're saying
No.
if it aligns with your values, your purpose, your goals, stick with it. And that is where the opportunities for growth and self-actualization lie. It's through doing those things and having that mindset that we're not going to just bow out or give up.
Yeah. And I think, I think that, if parents can actually help to instill their children with those qualities, um, then allied to their talents, their goals, their dreams, then because you can have all the dreams you like, but if you think that, your dreams are going to come, without much effort, forget about it. It's not.
Yeah. Really, really interesting.
Unless you're very lucky,
Yeah.
there may be some luck involved, but people do get approached and say, "Oh, I mean, people have got careers that've been spotted,
Yeah.
and without any effort, they were kind of brought on. And I think kind of then they had to kind of show grit. I'm thinking of Twiggy was spotted, and she you know she became quite famous, but then she'd actually developed herself,
Yeah.
and in all kind of areas. So I think so yeah. I mean, most of the time, it is a question of, and it's putting it in a way that it's going to be acceptable to children and
Mm.
adolescents, because I think if you talk about self-discipline, that may not be, the best way of putting it. So I think you need to put it in a way, in a language that it's going to be kind of acceptable. And I think that in a way, the more you can help people to come to their own conclusions about that. That's why having a Socratic dialogue with children and adolescents can be quite useful, rather than giving them the answers and telling them. Helping them to come to their own conclusions is a really important skill, I think, as a parent.
Yes, absolutely. So that back and forth, helping children come up with their answers with our guidance. And I'm really interested in what you mentioned about those who do. So, the let's talk about the winning mindset and people who are top performers, top sportsmen or women, children who are really performing at a high level in sport or music or drama or academics. And they're on a path where their performance is really important to them and their identity, because I do see families in that context. And I'm interested in the idea that for the child, winning is everything and losing is not an option. And as a result, they are training more and they are winning more, and then they might lose a match and they really struggle to regulate their emotional state.
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a phrase which says, yeah, losing may not be an option, but it may well be a consequence. You wouldn't necessarily choose it. What would you like to do, win or lose? Oh, I would like to win. But you're also going to have to, kind of, and that's why I think one of the things I like about rationally emotive behavior therapy, this is why I kind of still practice it, is that it helps you to deal with adversity. Right? It
Mm.
says, look, you're going to face adversities in life. You're gonna lose. You're going to be rejected. And there's going to all these adversities. So you're going to be criticized. You're not going to get what you want. Now, how are you going to deal with that? How would you like to deal with it? Would you like to kind of deal with it as healthily as you can, or would you like to disturb yourself about it and give yourself two problems for the price of one?
Oh,
You've
wow.
been rejected, and now you're disturbing yourself about it. So, and so although, you know, losing may not be an option, it certainly is a consequence.
Mm.
Criticism, you're going to be criticized. Why? Because you're dealing with people, and their brains are not, geared to your desires. And
Yeah.
so we have to, and I think that, helping children to deal with adversity is another key parenting skill.
Absolutely. And I think parents are really hungry to know how to have those conversations and how to sort of bring a healthier way of thinking in a child's psychology so they develop, in a way that, as you say, it's not two problems for the price of one.
Yeah.
Well, no, look, thank you so much. What we've covered so much and what amazing advice. So Windy, how can people call you and get in touch with you if they would like some sessions or a micro session or a single session?
Well, I have a website, www.windydryden.com, and there's a contact page there. And should anybody want to contact me, I'd be only pleased, to help if I can.
Thank you so much. And you can have people speak on the phone or face to face. Is that right?
Yes, well, yeah, I can, I mean, I think these days, this day and age, yes, I do have an office where people can come and we can do face-to-face work, or I'm happy to do things over Zoom or even telephone, or um, e- even carrier pigeon if any of your any of your parents are. Uh,
How did you know? How did you know? Well, thank you so much for bringing this help in an accessible way for people. Thank you for your contributions to our field. And thank you for sort of being really courageous and helping us think in a slightly different way, because I think that's what I think we need to be doing. People are struggling with mental well being. It does have intergenerational impact when we're talking about parents and their children. And I'm just very, very grateful for the work you do. So thank you.
my pleasure.
Take care.